Episode 1 The Death of a God, 10 to 19 AD. Hello and welcome to 202 Decades. Last time we saw the plans of the old Augustus go awry. His attempts to incorporate Germania had been dashed when the Romans were betrayed by Arminius, and in 9 AD, 3 legions had been slaughtered. The Roman settlements on the far side of the Rhine River were destroyed. Immediately after hearing news of the defeat, there was shock and anger on the part of Augustus, but also a sense of panic. There were fears that this defeat would lead to an invasion of Gaul by Arminius' coalition. The concern was legitimate. There would have been little resistance on the Rhine or anywhere nearby. The 17th, 18th, and 19th legions had been wiped out, and most of the other legions were still returning from Tiberius' campaigns in the Balkans. Just 2 legions remained along the Rhine, at modern Mainz. Gaul was vulnerable. Old nightmares of an invasion of Italy and a sack of Rome gnawed at the Roman people. Augustus immediately ordered several legions to the area, but it would be weeks before a proper defense could be made. The Romans got lucky though. Arminius' coalition was too preoccupied clearing out the Romans from the German side of the Rhine. While Arminius didn't lead his forces across the Rhine after the disaster, there were people crossing from Germania into Gaul. The destruction of Roman settlements in Germania was not instant, and some resisted. At the colony of Aliso, for weeks, Lucius Caedicus put up stiff resistance to a Germanic siege, keeping them tied up. Eventually, he and many of the soldiers and civilians he commanded fought their way back to the Rhine. Crossing, they found that the 2 legions from Mainz had reached the area. Not long after, Tiberius arrived with his legions in early 10 AD. Under direction from Augustus, he began to fortify the camps along the Rhine, making them not only bases of operations, but defensive structures. Gaul would be safe for now. Back across the Rhine, Arminius' coalition now controlled the inland territory between the Rhine and the Elbe River. His control of Germania was not total though. Many of the tribes along the North Sea coast in the lowlands of what's now the Netherlands still remained loyal to Rome. And on his eastern flank, Arminius had the Marcomanni to consider. The Marcomanni were a tribe that had originally been living between the Rhine and the Elbe, but when the initial Roman forays into the area began in the final decade BC, under their leader Maroboduus, they retreated across the Elbe and stationed themselves in Bohemia, modern Czech Republic. Maroboduus became their king and consolidated several tribes in the area. His ascension in power had made the Romans nervous, and if you remember from the past decade, Tiberius had been just about to invade the Marcomanni in 6 AD when the massive rebellion broke out in Illyria, and he had to move his legions there instead. This threat of an invasion was enough of a wake-up call for Maroboduus that he agreed to peace on good terms and became an ally of Rome. So Arminius was a bit hemmed in, with friendly tribes to Rome on his northwest, Rome to his west and south, and the Marcomanni to his east. He hoped, though, that news of his victory over the Romans would make Maroboduus rethink his alliance. He sent an envoy to the Marcomanni, asking for an alliance, and delivered the severed head of General Varus to Maroboduus. The king must have weighed his options. Sure, Arminius had defeated 3 legions, but there were 11 more legions ready to strike. And the Romans would be more careful in the future. Varus had been too trusting. So no, Maroboduus would not be joining in an anti-Roman alliance. To prove his goodwill, he sent Varus' head back to Rome, where it was buried. The Marcomanni would remain neutral, whatever came next in the conflict between Arminius and Rome. What came next, aside from fortifications of the Rhinelands, was a punitive expedition by Tiberius. The contemporary historian Paterculus says, Tiberius penetrated into the heart of the country, opened up military roads, devastated fields, burned houses, routed those who came against him, and without loss to the troops with which he had crossed, he returned, covered with glory, to winter quarters. But this description is more propaganda than truth. It seems likely that Tiberius led only a small, cautious raid, more to keep the Germans from trying anything than to reconquer. The next year, they again made small raids and let the Germans know that the Roman army was still active and in the area. That winter, though, Tiberius returned to Rome. In his place, Augustus appointed Tiberius' nephew/adopted son, Germanicus, who we will be discussing much more shortly. Tiberius needed to be back in Rome because Augustus could tell that his time on Earth was ending. Either in 12 or 13 AD, Augustus bestowed upon Tiberius all of his own powers as princeps. They were now essentially co-princeps. Transfer of power is always tricky. Even with all the forethought Augustus had put into his succession, it would be best if Tiberius was already in power, ready to take the steering wheel when Augustus died. Where would a threat to stability come from after Augustus' death, though? The Senate didn't seem likely. With Augustus' long reign and their declining power, the body took its role in governing less and less seriously. Being a senator was prestigious, sure, but the responsibilities of running the state got in the way of their comfort. Better to leave that busy work to Augustus or Tiberius, I guess. One other potential rallying point drew Augustus' attention in his final years. His friend and son-in-law, Agrippa, had died a couple of decades earlier, but he had left Augustus 5 grandchildren. The 2 older boys, as we mentioned last week, had seemed like obvious choices for succession, until they had died, one after the other, in 2 and 4 AD. Their pedigree made them candidates for succession, but many at the time were irked by their attitudes. Both of them had grown up in what was essentially a royal family, and had grown accustomed to all of the prestige and privileges that went along with being Augustus' grandsons and heirs. None of those concerns mattered once Gaius and Lucius were dead, but there was another brother I haven't mentioned yet. His name was Agrippa Postumus, since he was born shortly after the death of his father. He grew up in the same circumstances as his older brothers, but in their shadow. If Gaius and Lucius were pompous and prideful, Postumus went beyond them and displayed cruelty and a beastly nature. His behavior was so improper, Augustus had him first temporarily and then in 7 AD permanently exiled to an island off the coast of Italy, but not the same island his mother Julia had been sent to. Anyway, as Augustus could feel his death approaching, he went to visit his grandson on the island, to see if the years of isolation had changed the young man. He must have had some faint hope that someone of his own blood could be his successor. Clearly, what he found disappointed him, and his opinion was not moved. He continued his plans for Tiberius' succession. In 14 AD, Tiberius was heading to the port town of Brundisium to cross over the Adriatic Sea to oversee the restored peace in Illyria. Augustus traveled with him through Campania, the rich region south of Rome. But before they reached Brundisium, Augustus turned aside at Beneventum to rest in his estate at Nola, not far from Naples. The end was near now, and Augustus spent some time arranging his will, planning his funeral, and making an accounting of the empire. Illness was overtaking the 76-year-old princeps. What happened next isn't clear. Tiberius, hearing of his adopted father's illness, raced back to Nola, but it's not clear if he made it in time. Some say he arrived before his death and spent a full day discussing the empire's future. Others say he arrived too late. Either way, on the 19th of the month, which bears his name, Augustus passed from this world. Velleius Paterculus says, in his 76th year, in the consulship of Pompeius and Apuleius, he was resolved into the elements from which he sprang, and yielded up to heaven his divine soul. So what killed Augustus? The death of a 76-year-old, whose life had been interrupted by illness since his youth, hardly needs an explanation. Tacitus, though, ascribes his death to poisoning by his own wife, Livia. Why would Livia, who had stood beside Augustus for decades, suddenly poison her husband? Well, if you buy into the theory, she was fiercely loyal to her own sons. An extreme view of this conspiracy is that she not only killed Augustus, but all of his other possible successors, all to get her Tiberius on the throne. So, When Augustus went to visit his grandson, Agrippa Postumus, a few months before his death, according to this theory, Livia was afraid he would go back on his decision to appoint Tiberius and instead appoint his grandson. To stop Augustus from changing his mind, she fed him poisoned dates. Now, the conspiracy theory likely isn't true. Again, Augustus was 76 years old and had a long history of severe illness. He wouldn't have needed poison to kill him. A natural death would do. Besides, why would Augustus throw a decade of instruction and planning for Tiberius only to give it up for an extremely unsuitable heir? Among our sources, Tacitus and Cassius Dio make mention of Livia's role, but they were writing at least 40 years afterward. The contemporary writer, Paterculus, doesn't mention Livia at all in the narrative of Augustus's death. The rumor likely grew in the aftermath of Tiberius, since, as we'll see, the people turned against the second emperor of Rome. Regardless of what actually happened, the first days of Tiberius's reign were marked by a crime. Immediately following the death of Augustus, his last remaining grandson, Agrippa Postumus, was executed. Some blamed Tiberius, others blamed Livia. Both had the motive of removing a potential rallying point for opposition to Tiberius's rule. Other theories say Augustus had left instructions to kill Postumus once he had died. Or it could have been one of Augustus's trusted advisors. Whatever happened, let's not get too caught up in a 201-decade-old conspiracy theory. Augustus had left detailed plans for his funeral. A long procession of mourners followed the casket of Augustus from Nola back to Rome. As his body entered the city for his funeral, people flocked to the city from the surrounding countryside, and hundreds of thousands gathered. His casket was carried upon a bier of gold and ivory and walked from his home through the Forum to the Field of Mars. His coffin was placed upon a pyre and set alight. As the flames rose, a senator would later claim that an eagle was seen ascending from the fire, and another claimed he had seen Augustus's spirit rising to heaven. Augustus was dead, but he was no ordinary man. He was a god, as his father Julius Caesar had been. Augustus joined the pantheon of gods as the divine Augustus. The Senate soon began work on a temple of worship in his honor. Augustus was certainly an extraordinary figure, and probably one of the 10 most important people we will encounter in our 202 decades. He had stabilized the state after years of civil war, created order and stability, and had extended the borders. He had stimulated trade by building new colonies, opening new mines, ensuring safety at sea and on land, and keeping the highways free from bandits. People could now voyage in safety, trade in confidence, and live in peace. He had built or renewed 82 temples in Rome. He had added 170 public baths. He had constructed new roads, new aqueducts, new ports. He had hosted public games unlike any the people had seen before, and had granted them grain and oil and salt. But don't take my word for it. Let's hear from the ancients, and then from Augustus himself, what the divine Augustus accomplished. Velleius Paterculus, a contemporary of Augustus, says, "Right is now honored, evil is punished. The humble man respects the great, but does not fear him. The great has precedence over the lowly, but does not despise him. When was the price of grain more reasonable, or when were the blessings of peace greater? The Pax Augusta, which has spread to the regions of the east and of the west, and to the bounds of the north and of the south, preserves every corner of the world safe from the fear of brigandage. The cities of Asia have been restored. The provinces have been freed from the oppression of their magistrates. Honor ever awaits the worthy. For the wicked, punishment is slow but sure. Fair play has now precedence over influence, and merit over ambition. For the best of emperors teaches his citizens to do right by doing it, and though he is the greatest among us in authority, he is still greater in the example which he sets." Tacitus was born in 56 AD, and he writes of Augustus, "He organized the state, not by instituting a monarchy or a dictatorship, but by creating the title of first citizen. The empire had been fenced by the ocean or distant rivers. The legions, the provinces, the fleets, the whole administration had been centralized. There had been law for the Roman citizen, respect for the allied communities, and the capital itself had been embellished with remarkable splendor. Very few situations had been treated by force, and then only in the interests of general tranquility. Augustus didn't leave it to others to define his legacy. In his Res Gestae, he lists his accomplishments out for posterity in 35 sections. While the list isn't an outright lie, it clearly skims over less glorious aspects of his reign or twists them in a favorable way. It makes no mention of his failures. Here are some highlights by section. 2. Exiling and defeating the killers of Caesar. 5. Turning down the dictatorship offered to him by the people, as well as turning down a yearly consulship. 7. He was a triumvir for 10 years and princeps for 40 years. 8. He performed a census and found 4 million Roman citizens, then repeated it a second time and found 4.2 million, then again a third time and found 4.9 million. 13. The doors of the Temple of Janus, which were only closed during peace, had only been closed twice before Augustus in the history of Rome, but during his reign they were closed thrice. 15. To the plebs, the lower classes of Rome, he had given sums of money 4 separate times. He also distributed grain at his own expense. 17. He had aided the public treasury with his own money 3 times. 19, 20, and 21. He lists the buildings with which he adorned the Capitol. 22 and 23. He brags of the gladiatorial and wild animal hunts he funded, as well as a huge mock naval battle he arranged. 24. He didn't just adorn the capital, but also the provinces with temples. When the people had built silver statues in his name, he had them melted down and given to the temples of the provinces. 26. He extended the boundaries of all the provinces which bordered people not yet subject to Rome, including conquest in Spain and Germany and the Alps. He lists military expeditions into both Ethiopia and Arabia. 28. He lists locations where he established colonies for retired soldiers. 29. Recovering legionary standards from the Parthians of Persia. 30. Conquest of Illyria and Pannonia as far as the Danube River. 31. Received embassies from across the world as far as from India. 34. He transferred the republic from his own rule back to the control by the Senate and the Roman people, and he was granted the title of Augustus and given precedence above all while possessing no more power than any of his colleagues. 35. He was given the title Father of the Country. If you remember the life of Augustus from the prologues, you can see that several of these stretch the truth. It's humble bragging and it's propaganda, but it's useful to see what Augustus himself viewed as important among his accomplishments. 2 other important documents were left behind by Augustus. The first was his will, which was retrieved from the Vestal Virgins. It made Tiberius and Livia his heirs. He granted both of them his title of Augustus. For Tiberius, he said, "Since cruel fate has snatched from me my sons Gaius and Lucius, Tiberius Caesar will be my heir to 2/3. Even in his death, he is still making clear that Tiberius was his last choice. He also made Germanicus a secondary heir and ensured he received a smaller but still significant portion of his wealth. Finally, Augustus left behind a document accounting for the finances and status of the empire. Tiberius is said to have read the document before the Senate soon after Augustus' death. According to Tacitus, it contained a statement of the national resources, the strength of the burghers and allies under arms, the number of the fleets, protectorates, and provinces, the taxes direct and indirect, the needful disbursements and customary bounties catalogued by Augustus in his own hand, with the final clause advising the restriction of the empire within its present frontiers. Make note of that last part, within its present frontiers. Well, it's finally time to say farewell to Augustus, the refounder of Rome, who deserves a place alongside Romulus, above even Camillus, Scipio Africanus, or Julius Caesar himself. Goodbye, Octavian. Goodbye, Princeps. Goodbye, Divine Augustus. Hello, Tiberius. At the age of 55, Tiberius took the oath of office and was sworn in as the second president of At the age of 55, Tiberius became the second princeps of the Roman people. In September of the year 14, the Senate met to validate his role. He already had the administrative and military power that had been handed to him by Augustus, but that title, Augustus, and the title Father of the Country had not been handed to him yet. Tiberius tried to play the same act as Augustus had played, that of the reluctant and humble servant, who only accepts power or the Senate's titles when they beg him to take them. Tiberius played the role poorly. His communication skills were far from Augustus's. Rather than appearing humble, he came across as stubborn and insulting. The Senate were beyond accustomed to having a princeps as their head. Tiberius's unwillingness to rule confused the Senate and threw all of their patterns and plans into disorder. Unfortunately for both parties, this first meeting of the Senate under Tiberius established a new pattern of confusion. Tiberius would give the Senate vague, open-ended orders, and they would fall into debate about what he really meant. He probably was trying to get the Senate to act more independently, but for a body bent so low to Augustus, it wouldn't be easy to regain its old posture. As they were used to, the Senate competed to get in Tiberius's inner circle, which led them to groveling. Tiberius, wanting the Senate to increase its responsibilities and finding it unable to act without detailed instruction, called them men fit to be slaves. They tried to heap praises upon him, and he refused their flattery. When they proposed naming a month after him, as they had done for Julius Caesar and for Augustus, he only replied, "What will you do if there should be 13 Caesars?" We can see, even at this early stage of Tiberius's reign, he did not enjoy leading the Senate. This would only increase over time, and as we'll see next time, Tiberius's disdain for the Senate would lead Rome to a dark place. Out in the provinces, the death of Augustus was an excuse for the legions to try to better their positions. In Pannonia, the newly conquered region just south of the Danube, 3 legions were stationed together in their summer quarters. When news of Augustus's death arrived, a commander gave the legions a few days' break from their usual duties. But idle hands are the devil's workshop. Leaders among the common soldiers arranged to throw out their commanders and mutiny until their demands were met. They demanded to have the option to discharge from military service after only 16 years, down from 20. They demanded an increase in pay and that the veterans not be kept in their old regiments, but allowed to move into their own new regiment. Tiberius himself could have dealt with the mutiny, but not wanting to set a precedent that he could be summoned by a simple mutiny, he instead sent his son, Drusus, to Pannonia. Drusus arrived and skillfully dealt with the mutiny, convincing them to give up, with the persuasive help of a lunar eclipse and the help of 2 cohorts of the Praetorian Guard. He granted the average soldiers who had participated in the revolt total pardons if they handed over their leaders. The soldiers complied, and they laid down their revolt. Drusus went to work finding the leaders who had fled to a nearby forest. Upon finding them, they were executed. At nearly the same time, another mutiny broke out among the legions along the Rhine. Tiberius sent Germanicus to deal with them. With 3 mentions of this Germanicus already, it's time we give him a proper introduction. Germanicus Julius Caesar was the son of Tiberius's younger brother, Drusus, who had died unexpectedly in 9 BC. Drusus had campaigned widely in Germania and had been celebrated for his conquests by giving him the title Germanicus. His son Germanicus inherited that title. His mother was Antonia Minor, who herself was the daughter of Mark Antony and Augustus's sister, Octavia. Again, this is a reminder to look up a family tree of the Julio-Claudian dynasty to make a little more sense of these relationships. As a blood relative of both Augustus and Mark Antony, Germanicus seemed to possess the best qualities of both of them. In 6 AD, he had commanded alongside Tiberius in putting down the massive revolts in Illyria and was an excellent commander who inspired his men to follow him. He possessed such charisma that Rome quickly fell for him. Comparisons between him and Alexander the Great and Scipio Africanus came early and often. Officially, he was Tiberius's adopted son and heir. Augustus had seen his potential and had adopted Tiberius as son on the condition that Tiberius adopt Germanicus. Germanicus was again related to Augustus through marriage. His wife was Agrippina, the daughter of Agrippa and Julia, who was the daughter of Augustus. Together they had 6 children, one a future emperor and another a future emperor's mother. That Germanicus never became emperor, given his skills and pedigree, well, we'll get to that shortly. Under orders from Tiberius, Germanicus, who had just received command over Gaul, went to the Rhine to deal with the mutinous legions there. It was the 4 legions of the lower Rhine, meaning lower in elevation or downstream, that rebelled. According to Tacitus, the mutineers attempted to convince Germanicus to join them. Together, they could march on Rome, remove Tiberius, and make Germanicus emperor. Since Tiberius was so sure to pass over Germanicus and give the empire to his natural son instead. Tacitus is our source here, and the problem with this account is that he's writing about 80 years later, when other leaders had been convinced to lead the Rhine legions against Rome and overthrow the emperor. Tacitus is anachronistic here, providing an explanation for a thing belonging to a period before it actually existed. Similar to someone in our day speaking of President Roosevelt's social media campaigns during the Great Depression. Tacitus is a huge fan of Germanicus, and he uses Germanicus' refusal to join their treason to show his virtues. Regardless, the leaders of the mutiny listed their complaints to him, and Germanicus listened. Their requests were much the same as their comrades in Pannonia. A shorter length of service, better pay, that kind of thing. Unlike Drusus, who had persuaded the mutinous legions to disarm, Germanicus granted their request without consulting Tiberius and paid them a bonus out of his own pocket. He immediately dismissed the soldiers who had served their term, and instead of settling them in the same province, as was the norm, he instead settled them a ways away in the Alps. Better to have the troublemakers far from the legions. To further satisfy his troops, Germanicus then led them across the Rhine, again without approval from the princeps. Whether or not the legions had tried to make Germanicus their leader, Tiberius didn't like the sound of the reports coming from the Rhine. Either way, Germanicus was making unilateral decisions and gaining the personal loyalty of the legions there. A seed of fear and distrust began to grow in Tiberius' mind concerning his adopted son. Now in Germania, Germanicus led his troops into some good old-fashioned raiding. They headed a few days up the Ruhr River, not far from where modern Germany and the Netherlands meet, to the territory of the Marsi. The Romans massacred the inhabitants of the villages and plundered whatever they could carry. They fought their way back to the Rhine. Not a very kind thing to do, but it achieved his goals of keeping the soldiers busy and winning their admiration. When word reached Rome of the successful raids into Germania, Tiberius heaped praises upon Germanicus before the Senate, but his feelings were insincere. Every increase in popularity for Germanicus made Tiberius more nervous and insecure. That first campaign had been small in nature, merely to improve morale. The next 2 years, though, Germanicus would lead extensive and aggressive campaigns into the heart of the dark interior of Germania. Things wouldn't be so simple as marching in, murdering and pillaging, and leaving, though. Germanicus would have to be on alert. Arminius' coalition was prepared to defend their turf. In early spring of 15 AD, Germanicus led his legions out to the chief town of the Chatti tribe. They repeated the action they had taken the previous year, murdering, pillaging, and laying waste the area before heading back toward the Rhine. Before they crossed back into Gaul, though, a message reached Germanicus from Segestes, the father-in-law of Arminius, the one who had tried to warn the Romans of the ambush at the Teutoburg Forest. He asked for help. He and Arminius were enemies, and Segestes was being held captive by Arminius. Germanicus jumped at the opportunity and turned his army around. Fighting off the guards, he rescued Segestes and many of his relatives. Among them was Thusnelda, Arminius' wife, who he had kidnapped and made his bride. Segestes clearly felt more loyalty to Rome than to the coalition led by his daughter's abductor. After his rescue, Tacitus quotes him as saying, "This is not my first day of loyalty and constancy to the people of Rome. From the moment when the deified Augustus made me a Roman citizen, I have chosen my friends and my enemies with a view to your interests. Not from hatred of my own country, for the traitor is loathsome even to the party of his choice, but because I took the advantage of Rome and Germany to be one, and peace a better thing than war. For that reason I accused Arminius, to me the abductor of a daughter, to you, the violator of a treaty, in presence of Varus, then at the head of your army. Germanicus released Segestes to freedom, but Thusnelda, who was pregnant, he sent back to Italy. There she would have a son, and he would be raised among the Romans, in the city of Ravenna. Thusnelda was remembered afterward for her bravery and unconquerable spirit. This victory in freeing Segestes and capturing Thusnelda won Germanicus yet more praise and admiration. Under approval from Tiberius, Germanicus was hailed as Imperator. The capture of his wife drove Arminius into a rage. He rode through the Cherusci and the tribes of his coalition, rousing them and mustering them for war. In a speech that fits the script of a Hollywood movie, Tacitus puts these words in Arminius' appeal. A peerless father, a great commander, a courageous army, whose united powers had carried off one wretched woman. Before his own sword, 3 legions, 3 generals had fallen. For he practiced war, not by the help of treason, nor against pregnant women, but in open day, and against men who carried arms. In the groves of Germany were still to be seen the Roman standards, which he had hung aloft to the gods of their fathers. If they loved their country, their parents, their ancient ways, better than despots and new colonies, then let them follow Arminius to glory and freedom, rather than Segestes to shame and slavery. I'll be waiting for the movie to come out. Many of the tribes surrounding the Cherusci were convinced to join Arminius in pushing out the Romans again. Reports began to come in to Germanicus of a huge number of Germans preparing for war. His response was to order the 4 legions stationed at Mainz on the Upper Rhine to cross into Germania and raid into the south of the country. This helped to divert forces away from his base on the Lower Rhine. He knew the risks of marching openly here was extremely high. So, instead of a slow, cautious march, he instead began an amphibious campaign, with hundreds of vessels constructed to carry the army and supplies. They wound through rivers and along the North Sea coast and descended upon the German coalition from the north, smashing them between Germanicus in the north and the legions from Mainz to the south. One of Germanicus's lieutenants, named Stertinius, was fighting and looting in the territory of the Bructeri tribe, while, in the course of their raiding, they stumbled upon the golden legionary standard of the lost 19th Legion. This recovery uplifted the morale of the armies. Germanicus was now near the site of the disaster of the Teutoburg Forest, and decided to pay the scene a visit. It had been 6 years. What he found there was the ghastly remnants of a massacre. In the plain between were bleaching bones, scattered or in little heaps, as the men had fallen, fleeing or standing fast. Hard by lay splintered spears and limbs of horses, while human skulls were nailed prominently on the tree trunks. In the neighboring groves stood the savage altars at which they had slaughtered the tribunes and the chief centurions. Survivors of the disaster, who had escaped the battle or their chains, told how here the legates fell, there the eagles were taken, where the first wound was dealt upon Varus, and where he found death by the suicidal stroke of his own unhappy hand. They spoke of the tribunal from which Arminius made his tirade, all the gibbets and torture pits for the prisoners, and the arrogance with which he had insulted the standards and eagles. Rather than terrifying the legions, the scene of this battlefield caused their blood to boil with vengeance. They spent the day burying their dead, but not long after, Germanicus gathered all his troops and headed straight for the heart of the Cherusci. Arminius fell back before the Romans, leading them farther and farther into Germania. An advance company of soldiers and cavalry spotted Arminius and began a chase to capture him. Arminius continued his retreat, but as the cavalry charged after him, German tribesmen charged out of the woods from both flanks. Arminius then turned around and attacked. The Roman cavalry took heavy casualties and began a retreat. The infantry of the Roman advance company caught up to the cavalry, and heavy fighting continued, with the Romans forming and holding their line. Barely. The German attack suddenly pulled back, though. Germanicus and the rest of the army had arrived, and Arminius knew his light infantry was no match in a pitched battle against the Romans. The battle was a stalemate, with the Germans unwilling to attack, and the Romans unwilling to march further into the country as winter approached. Germanicus pulled his army back, and when they were at a safe distance, he divided his forces up to march back to the Rhine in 3 companies. He taking the north route, Stertinius heading south, and another commander named Caecina leading 4 legions back in the middle. Arminius watched the retreats closely. As Caecina marched back, his army came to a large marshland between them and the Rhine. The journey around the swamp would add days to their march. Fortunately for them, a series of long causeways, or in Latin, pontus longi, had been constructed across the marshes during the Roman occupation in the prior decades. The scouts, though, had bad news. The causeways were broken, washed out, and likely sabotaged. Going ahead would not be easy. As Caecina weighed his options, his scouts brought him more bad news. Arminius and his army had rapidly followed him and were closing in to attack. Caecina instructed a fortified camp be built at the edge of the marshes against the entrance to the causeways. Half his soldiers would defend the camp. The other half would get to work rebuilding the causeways. Throughout the day, the engineers were harassed with a constant barrage of javelins and sling bolts. The Romans spent the night in their camp, while the Germans camped out on the higher ground above. As the sun rose in the morning, the legions packed up their camp. They arranged themselves into a large square, with a supply train in the center, allowing it to stay on the causeway. This meant, though, that most of the soldiers had to trod through the marshes to stay in their formation. The going was slow. Arminius' army watched from dry ground, waiting for their chance to strike. The supply wagons soon became mired in the mud and began to slow. Their anxieties would have grown as the sun rose higher, and they could still easily see the Germans behind them, waiting. Their cohesion began to break as they broke from their lines to help move along their supplies faster. This breakup of the lines was just what Arminius had been waiting for. His soldiers sped into the marsh, quickly reached the bogged-down Romans, and began to attack from all sides. Many were killed. The survivors fled back to the dry ground, where they had camped the night before, and reformed into a defensive line. The Germans feared attacking the Romans in formation, so they pulled back and watched again. The Romans built another camp, this one even more impromptu than the last. Another night passed, during which the Romans fell into a panic, thinking their camp overrun. Only Caecina himself was able to calm them down. On the German side, Arminius advised waiting until they had left their camp before attacking again. Their attack that day had been very successful. Why not try it again? But his advisors pointed at the weak-looking camp and advised an immediate assault in the morning. Their counsel went out. Come morning, the Germans attacked the earthen wall of their camp, but the Romans were ready for them. They may have been in unfamiliar territory, but fighting from behind fortifications, that was their specialty. The Germans took heavy losses in their assaults, and the Romans stood their ground. Arminius, seeing nothing would come of these attacks, had to pull his army back. This gave Caecina's men space to repair the causeways and move the supply wagons along. They escaped, and slowly but surely reached the Rhine. Caecina was awarded a triumph for his success. The Roman survival in the Battle of the Pontus Longi had averted a second disastrous defeat by Arminius. They passed the winter in their camps across the Rhine. When spring of the year 16 arrived, Germanicus led out 8 legions into Germania again. They made their way to Aliso, that fort I mentioned at the start of the episode, where the Romans had held out before escaping to Gaul. Germanicus stationed his forces here and reinforced the fort. This secured a stretch of safe passage for the Romans. After garrisoning the fort, the army marched deeper into Germania, making a series of raids which ravaged the region. Arminius could no longer wait for the perfect opportunity to strike. He had to stop the Romans' destruction or lose all credibility among his coalition. Near the Weser River, Germanicus' army met Arminius in the Battle of Idistaviso. Exact details of the battle are lacking. Tacitus just says, from 9 in the morning to nightfall, the Germans were slaughtered, and 10 miles were covered with arms and dead bodies. The Romans repelled the German attacks and inflicted heavy casualties. Arminius himself was injured in the battle, and he and his army retreated a safe distance away. Celebrating their victory, the Romans constructed a mound out of the weapons and armor of the slain Germans. When this trophy was spotted, Arminius' army was enraged. They had begun retreating across the Elbe River, but hearing of this insult to their pride, they turned around and attacked the Romans again. In this battle of the angry Varian Wall, the Romans stood atop an embankment and fended off the German charges again. Arminius' army took more heavy casualties and finally retreated for good. In victory, the army of Germanicus raised another mound dedicated to Tiberius, enlisting the names of the conquered tribes. With the Germans defeated and scattered, Germanicus headed home with his troops. On their return journey, they ravaged the Marsi tribe again and forced their leader to reveal the location of another legionary standard. Soldiers were immediately sent to recover it. That makes 2 of the 3 golden eagles recovered. After 3 years of campaigns, Germanicus had become a legend to his soldiers and the people of Rome. His recovery of the 2 golden eagle legionary standards and his victories against Arminius had done a great deal to put the nightmare of Varus's disaster behind them all. There had been secret fears that the Romans had lost their military vitality, but Germanicus had cured all of that. Germanicus may have been planning on a proper conquest of the area, rolling back the clock to how things were before Arminius' betrayal. Before he could go out on campaign for another year, though, he was suddenly recalled to Rome. Tiberius was in a conundrum when it came to his adopted son. On one hand, Germanicus was acting on his own prerogative in Germania, and his popularity was sky high. On the other hand, his victories reflected well on Tiberius' regime. Every report of a victory would have brought cheers among the people, but must have left Tiberius more and more uncomfortable. Tiberius also wasn't on board with a conquest or reconquest of Germania. Augustus had left instructions not to expand beyond the Rhine, and Tiberius seemed to agree with this. As we saw last time, he and Augustus felt that the conquest wasn't worth the effort. So, in 17 AD, Tiberius recalled Germanicus to Rome, ostensibly to celebrate a triumph. Germanicus had his victorious entry into Rome, with a triumphal parade through the city, with captives displayed, including Thusnelda, the wife of Arminius. Once the celebrations had ended, though, Tiberius did for Germanicus what Augustus had done for Agrippa and Tiberius himself, granting him control of the eastern half of the empire. On paper, this was a promotion for Germanicus, a step up from governor of Gaul. Germanicus knew, though, that the move was not a real promotion. Tiberius had elevated him not to prepare him to rule, but to separate him from the legions loyal to him. Though, to be fair to Tiberius, the eastern provinces were in a bit of a mess, and Germanicus would have real work to do fixing things up. And perhaps I'm falling too far in line with Tacitus, who adores Germanicus and plays him up as the true Roman who falls victim to the tyranny of Tiberius. Reading between the lines, Germanicus appears pompous and theatrical, taking unnecessary risks and nearly paying the price for his campaigns in Germania. Germanicus traveled east at a leisurely pace, making stops at Athens and other sites on his way to Syria. A man named Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, who had recently been the governor of Syria and was a loyal confidant of Tiberius, and was assigned to aid Germanicus. Piso's role was to help guide and restrain Germanicus, but also to report back to Tiberius about Germanicus' actions. However their relationship began, Piso and Germanicus quickly fell into quarreling. In just one incident, Germanicus ordered soldiers be sent to Armenia, either by Piso himself or his son, but Piso ignored the orders and the troops were not sent. Shortly after, the Parthian Empire's king of kings, Artabanus, had sent word to Germanicus. The prior king of Parthia, Vonones, was living as a refugee in Roman Syria, but the new king was uncomfortable with this potential usurper so close to his borders. Germanicus eagerly agreed to move Vonones, not only to keep the peace between Rome and Parthia, but also to spite Piso, who was friends with the old king. The two came to hate each other, with Piso openly ignoring Germanicus' authority. In January of 19 AD, Germanicus traveled down from Syria to Egypt. There was a severe famine going on there that was of huge concern, because Egypt itself supplied much of the grain for the rest of the empire. Germanicus issued an edict, lowering the price of grain there and releasing stores from the state's granaries. Here too, the people went wild, praising the charismatic heir to the empire. There was just one small problem, though. Any senator required express permission from Tiberius to enter the province. Germanicus had not asked. Augustus had instituted this rule when he saw that the wealth of Egypt could hold his empire together or tear it apart if it fell into a rival's hands. So when Germanicus entered Egypt, Tiberius issued a sharp rebuke. It's not hard to see the danger Germanicus posed when seen from Tiberius' point of view. So, after touring the ancient sites of Egypt, which were ancient even then, Germanicus left Egypt and returned to Antioch in Syria by summer. He arrived to find all of his decrees and orders had been reversed by Piso. Enraged now, Germanicus tried to send Piso back to Rome. It's unclear if he had that authority. Piso left Antioch and went the short distance to Seleucia, Antioch's port to the Mediterranean. He may have been waiting. Almost immediately after arriving back in Antioch, Germanicus began to become sick. Unlike Augustus, Germanicus had been healthy all his life. Here, poison was suspected immediately. Despite Piso's absence from the city, Germanicus and Agrippina, his wife, suspected Piso's work. It wasn't only the hatred the two had for each other that made them suspect his worsening health was from poison. Weird objects used in black magic began to be discovered around their home. Tacitus says, explorations in the floor and walls brought to light the remains of human bodies, spells, curses, lead tablets engraved with the name Germanicus, charred and blood-smeared ashes. Germanicus briefly began to recover, but then worsened and died. His wife was stricken with anger and grief. Agrippina brought the ashes of Germanicus back to Rome and publicly accused Piso of the murder. What she didn't say out loud, others did. Piso must have poisoned Germanicus under orders from Tiberius. The people of Rome were devastated, acting as if an emergency had been declared, openly mourning the loss of their hero. At the beginning of the next decade, the Senate will put Piso to trial and convict him, not for the murder of Germanicus, but for his disobeying in his later attempt to gain control of Syria by force. Before his sentencing, seeing that Tiberius was not going to intervene for his old friend, Piso committed suicide. This left everyone unsatisfied. The death of Germanicus ended what goodwill the people of Rome had for Tiberius. They suspected him of killing this true Roman. This was their first taste of the dark side of autocracy. In the next decade, they would get to taste it more and more. The imperial guard, called the Praetorians, would lead this dark turn, under the leadership of a man named Sejanus, who Tiberius had appointed as Praetorian prefect in 15 AD. We will see the return of the purges that Rome had been free of since the civil wars had ended. The empire was falling into military dictatorship. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating and a review. You can follow the show on Twitter at 202 Decades. I'll see you next time.